What's up, cool kids? Next on the review list is identifying assumptions. Assumptions are unstated within the argument, so it's that piece of information that is needed as a connection to make a full argument. So consider this short argument. There is no point going to the chemist to consult the pharmacist. There is only a woman behind the counter. So here we have the reason. There is no point in going into the chemist shop to consult the pharmacist at the moment. And we have the conclusion that, or the reason to back that conclusion up, because there's one woman behind the counter. Now, if you are tuned into the concept of sexism, you may quickly notice that the assumption in this argument, women cannot be pharmacists, or that pharmacists are always male. Now, when we look at this, that piece of information is something that automatically ends up in your mind. And that's how assumptions work. It's that missing connection in an argument that the author expects you to make in order to get to the conclusion. There's only one behind the counter doesn't work unless you add in the aspect that pharmacists are always male. That's the assumption. Your mind makes that connection, but sometimes it's hard to articulate that. So in this case, we are looking at it from a perspective of when we identify assumptions, we're identifying that missing piece to the argument. An assumption is an unstated part of the argument. Sometimes something which is taken for granted and not mentioned directly because it seems obvious to the arguer. So those are the important points. It's not stated. It's a piece of information they expect you to get. They think it's obvious to anybody who's reading it. So they don't mention it. They want you to make that connection in your mind. Sometimes the assumption is a sound one and sometimes not. And that's important. That's kind of how we kind of look at assumptions. You can identify assumption, but identifying ones that are incorrect or hurt the argument, as in the case of the argument where we're looking at about the pharmacist, which it's not a sound argument. Obviously, women can be pharmacists. So that would be a flaw within the concept of the argument. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But the idea of just identifying that piece of information is tricky to do. Some of them are slightly more complicated, and we'll see that in the next example. So if we look at how this argument could be written, if you include the assumption in it, there's only a woman behind the counter, and women cannot be pharmacists. Therefore, there is no point in going into the chemist shop to consult the pharmacist at the moment. If you take that argument as a whole, it makes sense of an argument. It's not a good argument because obviously this right here is false. But it fits as an argument because you have this extra piece of information included, that connection that the author expects you to make. Just having this here and the conclusion with it doesn't quite work as well because you need that assumption there. You have to have that piece of information for the argument to be complete. So we're going to look at another example. In analyzing arguments, there is just as essential to identify and evaluate the assumption as it is to examine the explicit reason. The explicit is stuff that's actually written there. Assumptions are not. Assumptions are not actually written on the paper. It's a missing piece of information to complete the argument. This is because assumptions are playing an important role in the reasoning process. They are needed. You can see that from the example. That piece of information that women cannot be pharmacists is needed for that argument to be complete. It doesn't make sense without that assumption, but the author expects you to make that connection. So here we have another example. So it is important to reduce the amount of air travel as it has a significant impact on global warming. Increasing the cost of cheap holiday flights will substantially reduce air traffic. So here we have an argument. The conclusion is that reducing the amount of air travel has a significant impact on global warming. Oh, this is the conclusion. Increasing the cost of cheap holiday flights will substantially reduce the air traffic. The reason to support that or back that up is that other information. Now, this isn't a complete argument. It doesn't make sense like this. So what is the missing information? Right here and right here. Once again, it is important to reduce the amount of air travel as it has a significant impact on global warming. Increasing the cost of cheap holiday flights will substantially reduce air traffic. So the first assumption is that increasing the cost of holiday flights will discourage passengers from taking them. The idea that, hey, we're going to make it more expensive for you to travel during the holidays. And as a result, less people are going to want to do that, which it might not have an impact at all. We don't know that. Same thing with the second assumption. Holiday traffic is a substantial element of air travel. That assumption, that this idea that if we just reduce holiday flights, it's actually going to reduce air traffic. We don't know if holiday travel is a substantial element of air travel. It might be very minor compared to business and military use of aircraft or various other reasons that people travel besides going on holiday. And in this case, we're thinking about holiday travel, not just going during the holidays. As a thing from British perspective, a holiday for them is vacation. So increasing the cost of vacation flights would be would be the way of looking at it. It is not easy in this case to say whether the assumptions are sound or not. The first is based on hypothetical reasoning. This idea, if we continue to do this, and this will be the result of it. We don't know. Once again, you can't predict the future. We've already talked about that in issues with reasoning. As for establishing whether a substantial portion of air traffic is holiday-based, this will require research. Therefore, we cannot say that the assumptions in this passage are necessarily flaws in the reasoning. We don't know. But what we have done is achieve the identification of the missing parts argument, that rest of the information that makes that argument fully complete. You add in those two pieces of information, that argument becomes a whole argument. And the argument makes a lot more sense. So some practical tips. When asked to identify assumptions in a passage, you are unlikely to score 4 marks if you simply write them out. It is necessary to clarify why the assumption may be false by pointing out an alternative possibility. The word whereas is useful in this context. And finally, sometimes you may encounter questions that ask what needs to be assumed for the statement to be true and what are the alternative possibilities are. So again, this is looking at, okay, going back to that first example of women cannot be pharmacists. If I say women can be pharmacists as an alternative, then it ruins the whole argument. As a result, we can point that out as being a poor assumption and it's being a flawed form of reasoning. You'll also often be asked to identify flaws or weaknesses with an argument. If you can see that the assumptions are being made and they're clearly false, these count as flaws. It's no different than identifying the flaws in the regular argument. You're just doing so for the unstated portions. 20% of the people in the world own 80% of its wealth. Clearly, action needs taken to redress the balance. So here we have the conclusion that we need to redress the balance. Why? Because 20% of the people in the world own 80% of the wealth. Okay, that's part of an argument. What's the missing part? That there is an issue with that. There is an assumption that this gross global inequality is unacceptable. This idea that 20% of the people own 80% of its wealth is a problem. That's the assumption, that is a problem in itself. And that's why that argument works. That's why we need to redress the balance. That's why we need to fix this issue according to this argument. It is a view that a majority would accept. Most of the people, because 80% of the people fall into the part that doesn't control that much money. A view of the majority would accept it. So it would be difficult to make a case for this being a flawed argument because of its assumption. Try to remember to precede the word assumption with adjectives such as false or sound. To help identify crucial assumptions, use the negative or reverse test. Convert what you think is an assumption into its opposite to see if the conclusion still holds true. This is illustrated below in the first argument. There's only a woman behind the counter. Women can be pharmacists. There's no point going into the chemist shop. So obviously, when we reverse it, it makes the whole argument fall apart. So it works. This reverse test works. It shows that, hey, this is not a sound argument or a sound assumption. The same applies for the third argument. 20% of the people in the world own 80% of its wealth. Gross global inequalities are acceptable. Clearly, action needs to be redressed the imbalance. Once again, when we apply the reverse test, if gross global inequalities are acceptable, then there would be no need to redress the balance because it's fine as it is. So there needs to be no action taken. So as a result, when we apply the reverse, the argument falls apart. That means it is a good assumption, or you have at least identified the proper assumption. Identifying assumptions. Avoid writing about trivial assumptions that do not relate significantly to the conclusion of an argument. Here's a brief version of a large argument. Although some people claim that schools should not interfere with what children eat, general health and academic performances are enhanced by a balanced diet. A diet lacking in fresh fruit and vegetable leaves children more vulnerable to illnesses and absences from school. Some parents are not aware that a lunchbox treats may be unsuitable fare for the children. Certain foods and additives found in sweets and fizzy drinks may make some children hyperactive, and hyperactivity makes children unlikely to take detailed instruction. A school's priority must be the effective education and welfare of children. Therefore, schools should control the content of students' lunchboxes. So here's our conclusion right here, that schools should control the content of student lunchboxes. Some might point out the passage and assumes that all children bring their lunches in boxes, whereas a few may bring it in bags. This is an assumption that is not a crucial one. The reverse test shows that it makes little or no difference to the main conclusion. So if we apply the reverse test here, it doesn't really have an impact at all. So the reverse, some children do not bring their lunches in boxes. This doesn't interfere with the conclusion at all, that the contents of lunch boxes should be controlled. So what they bring their lunches in doesn't matter. Lunchbox, bag, backpack, inside of a stuffed animal. It doesn't matter. What actually matters is the content. So at most, a few students might temporarily escape through a loophole in the rules by bringing their lunch in bags instead of boxes, and others might perceive this as unfair until schools swiftly reworded the rules to include all lunch containers. But the health of the majority would still benefit from the enforcement of lunchbox rule. It should be clear that the issue of the bags as opposed to boxes is a minor quibble that really doesn't have an impact on the argument at all. So remember, assumptions should identify should have an impact on the conclusion. They should either enhance it or hurt it. In some cases, it's not going to, so those are assumptions that you don't need to worry about. All right, well, that's it for this one. As always, be safe, wear seatbelts.